All right, so this is where we left off. We have sort of our Twitter clone, and we were cloning, and I think I have this running as well. This was like the PHP equivalent. And so we had cloned it functionality-wise. So in the PHP version, when I want to submit a tweet, I go into this form, and I say tweet, 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 and I submit it. And it gets added to this list at the top. And if I submit a tweet that's either too small, so less than 1 character, or too large, more than 140 characters, I get an error message. And that's about it. That was the functionality that we were trying to clone. If we go back to our Rails version, we have that same capability now. So this is the list of tweets that are in the system. When I do my tweet, 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 and I submit that, it gets added to the top of the list. We have an extra feature in that we get a success message up at the top. And if I view source, we'll see that that's a paragraph which has a class of success on it. And if I submit an invalid tweet, and my validations ensure 1 to 140 characters for a valid tweet. So an invalid tweet, I get a sorry message, and that's inside of a P with a class of error. So those two classes are going to give us the ability to style up these errors nicely. Similar to this, we'll make the success message maybe with a green background instead of a red one. Today is not going to be an overly technical lecture in terms of Rails programming. It's mainly going to focus on making this, which is sort of a very plain looking site that has the functionality, look a little bit more like this site, which is a little prettier in terms of the fact that it has rounded corners, basically. It's what makes it prettier, I guess. And it's got a nice gray box on it. So that's the goal. We're going to effectively just steal the CSS that has been used on this site, but reformat it to be a little bit more SASS related. So we'll use some nesting and some variables and whatnot to make it a little bit more SASS friendly. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to modify the markup a little bit, because there's a few things I sort of want the markup to be very similar. And so this is the markup of the site we're cloning. I've got a overall div called wrapper that's wrapping all of my content. I already have that in my Rails version. That's this right here. So this is this div of ID wrapper. If we look further, we've got a form here. There's no special ID on that, so I don't have to worry about that. Here we've got a UL that has an ID of tweets. I don't really need that ID. This is the only UL in my entire system, and it's inside of the wrapper div, so I can just target ULs that happen to be inside of a div with an ID of wrapper, and that should be suitable for styling purposes. I think the only other thing that I'd like to replicate is the placeholder text. The fact that here in the input button it says what's going on, which is just placeholder, and when you go to type into it, that disappears. And so that's just an HTML5 property. That's the placeholder attribute. And so to add these kind of attributes to our form, which is made using Rails, we're going to go into that view, which is this one right here. Just to keep it up, I'll also bring up the application layout. This is where that form is being created. So we've got a form for tweet, and inside of it we've got 2 form elements being built using the F variable, the form builder that gets passed as a block. One of them is for the text field, one is for the submit button. The first argument is the property of the tweet that we are trying to set. So this text field is for the status. We can now add any other arguments we want, and all of these arguments are going to become attributes on the HTML tag that's being produced. So if we want a placeholder tag, we just say placeholder. And if we wanted to say what's going on, question mark, we just save that. So it's just a key value pair in the Rails code. Now when I reload my source in, here I'll just reload it like this. You can see now that placeholder is inside of the form as well. And it's even gone to the length of entitizing my single quote. So Rails will try to turn problematic characters like single quotes, a double quote, slashes, those kind of things, less thans, greater thans, into their entitized equivalents so that you don't accidentally close a string or cause a HTML formatting error or invalidate your HTML in any way. So it's nice it does that for us. If I reload this version here, you can see now I've got my placeholder text showing inside of my input. Good. To begin with, for the CSS styling, I'm going to start with just straight up using the CSS from the site that we're cloning. So I'll just go to that site and I'm just going to copy that code. And the location where I'm going to put it is in my app assets folder in the style sheets folder. And when I created my tweets controller, this tweets.css.scss file was created for me. That's where I'm going to put this code. For each of the controllers that you end up creating by way of a generator, you will get a tweets or whatever the name of the controller is, .css.scss. They all get loaded on every page. So it's not like these rules only get loaded up for the controller, but it's a way of sort of grouping rules. So rules that have to do with tweets should go into the tweets.css.scss file. And you can create your own file. So any file you put in here that's either a .css or a .scss will automatically be included in your project. So initially I'll just paste this in. It's not going to perfectly work to begin with, but some of the rules will work to start. So I go back to my site, and yeah, I can reload it. We're getting there. We're not quite ready, but it's almost there. So the rules for the unordered list didn't apply. The rules for this input didn't apply. Those I can go and fix. I have some general rules that I've applied to my HTML document itself and the body. Those I'm going to leave alone. I'm going to use some sort of SASS capabilities, sort of the nesting capabilities for things like the UL and the form stuff. They're all elements that are nested inside of the wrapper ID. So I'm actually going to nest the CSS. I could do the same thing with the body and the HTML. Like I could nest this body rule inside of the HTML rule, but it's not really required. Your document's only ever going to have one body element and one HTML element, so it doesn't really add to any clarity or sort of, it doesn't give you any extra power of styling to nest this body inside of there, although it would work. So I'm going to get rid of the end of this wrapper tag, the close curly brace. I'm going to nest all of these rules over inside of it. This also isn't fully required, but I just wanted to show the nesting capabilities. I'm going to remove the reference to an ID of tweets, because the ID in, I don't have an ID on my UL at all. If I go and view this particular system, I just have a UL. And one thing you can notice within Chrome, when you specify an element, so when you go to the little hourglass and you find an element and you click on it, it shows you sort of the hierarchy of where that element exists as a CSS rule down below. So this is like a UL that's inside of a div with an ID of wrapper, inside of a body, inside of HTML. It's a nice thing to sort of, if you want to know how to style it, you get those rules right there. So it's just, I'm going to apply my styles to ULs that appear inside of a wrapper. And so here's a UL that appears inside of a wrapper. I can even nest this LI rule inside of this UL rule, because that's what it sort of means. So, oops, I hit F1 by accident. So I'll input or indent that, and I'll do that like this. This should now I now have sort of nicely styled list items. I can, again, hover over and find them. And again, I just like looking in Chrome, it's always nice to, when you pick an individual element, over on the right-hand side here, you can see all the different rules that apply, either rules that are sort of default rules from your browser or rules that are coming from a CSS style sheet, and you can mess around with them. You can toggle them on and off. You can modify colors. None of these changes will stay in the long run. They'll go away the moment you reload the page. But sometimes for CSS, it's nice to be able to play around with your CSS rules interactively, and then once you're happy with how they have worked out, then hard code them into a CSS file. Yeah?
How did you get this window up?
Control-Shift-I. So Control-Shift-I, same if you just go to the, what is it, Tools and Development Tools. And so it's the Elements section. It's almost identical to what you get inside of Firebug, the extension. It happens to be built right into Chrome. And so Control-Shift-I brings you in here. In the Elements tab, you have this nice little magnifying glass, and that gives you the ability to click on individual elements and then mess with their styles. Very, very powerful. One of the most powerful aspects of it is that you can, sort of the top of the styles here where it says element.style, you can just click into there and then add styling rules for playing around. And so if I said, oh, okay, so I don't know, some other rule, like I could make a background image, and it's all nice and autocomplete, so I can say background image is, and then I can specify the URL, and I can do that. And then I can also toggle that rule on and off. So reload that. Most of my rules, as I said, are working. This input isn't properly working yet, and I'm going to go and debug as to why that's happening. That's this right here. In my original system, I had an input that I gave an ID to. These days with my CSS, I'm trying to avoid using IDs and just rely on classes or other identifiers. If you notice here, for these rules, these are all rules that apply to the submit button, this button right here. A submit button is just an input that has a type of submit on it. You can do these wonderful kind of attribute selectors in CSS. I used to avoid them because they weren't supported very well with the browsers, but these days they are. All browsers, all modern browsers can do these kind of attribute selectors. So here I'm saying, you know, form input type submit. That's great. This one could be form input type text. And now all of these rules will apply to that input of type text if I've done this right. And I have. So that's looking a little bit better now. What else have I got going on here? I could probably do a bit more nesting if I wanted to. Like all of these things are inputs that are inside of a form, so I could directly target form and nest the inputs within there, but I won't bother. I've got one bit of functionality that's going to be broken. When I successfully add a tweet, that's going to work, and my tweet's going to display up top. We're eventually going to want to add some styling to this success message, but at least everything looks nice in the rest of the page, and I can just apply the styling to that. But if I get an error, the error displays nicely, but I've got this tweet that has now moved over. My tweet button has been bumped down onto the next line. The reason this is happening, and again I'll go to my Chrome tools and I'll look at my form. When Rails builds a form where an error has just occurred, it actually wraps the offending input in an extra div so that you can apply specific stylings to that div. So the input that caused the validation error was this input, the status input. So it's actually wrapped my status input with a div that has a class of field with errors on it. So I could, if I wanted to, style field with errors, and I could say put a like a red box around that. If you look at how scaffolding works, when you scaffold up a CRUD system in Rails and you submit and there's a validation error, it's actually what it does for you. It sort of highlights in red the fields that have caused the validation error. So it's just giving you that extra capability if you want to give your users some indication as to where this error went wrong. The problem is that divs themselves are block level elements, meaning that it's going to cause a new line to occur. I went to the trouble of setting this input of type text to inline block so that the two inputs would stack side by side beside each other. So now I've got to apply another rule to this field with errors. I basically have to make it so that it has a display of inline block so that it'll be fixed like that. So I need to do that in my rules. So I'll go back to my CSS. Here's where I'm setting the display of inline block for this form element. So I'm going to pull that out of there, put it down here, pull this rule out as well, and sort of replicate it down below like this. And then I'm going to say not only should it apply to a form with an input of type text, it should also apply to divs with a class of field with errors. Field with errors. And so the only reason I pulled this one down is because now this is a rule that applies to both of these, and I like to sort of group my rules when they apply to multiple elements. Instead of having display inline repeated in these two locations, I have it in one location, and then the two individual elements that it applies to, or the two individual selectors that it applies to. The other thing I like to do, which I haven't done here, I can do it with a hotkey in VI, but I don't think I can do it in Komodo, is I tend to order my CSS properties alphabetically. And so it might seem like a little thing, but if you end up having CSS style sheets that grow really, really large, it's nice to have things ordered in that way, because you can go to a particular rule and you know that your width rule is always at the bottom, or that your padding rule is always sort of close to the bottom, or your background's up near the top. And with VI, I can just select a set of text and I can, say sort, and it'll sort the lines for me, so it's not a lot of work to keep it alphabetized. I like to do that with my CSS. CSS is sort of horrible, but sort of awesome, right? It's a great language. It gives us a lot of power, but it's also got this history of all sorts of hacks, and it can be sometimes really frustrating. And it often gets built organically, which means you start with good intentions and it keeps growing and growing and growing, and eventually you've got like a single file that has 10,000 lines in it full of CSS, and it's too much. So you always want to try to manage your CSS as much as possible so that it doesn't get out of control. The other thing I often do with SASS is that because I can create variables in SASS, I try to get rid of all sort of magic colors in my code. So in regular programming, we try to get rid of magic numbers in our code by turning them into constants or named variables, so that we don't just have the number 50 or the number 2 somewhere in our code and it means something to us but not to everyone else. The same thing sort of goes for colors in CSS. All of these colors, what are they? Why did we choose them? And maybe they're being reused over and over throughout the document. It might be nice to create a SASS variable for each of these colors, define them all up the top, name them well, and then if we want to play around with our colors, we just play around with the variables, and that gets sort of propagated throughout our system. The other thing is, just by looking at them, it's very hard to know what the colors look like. Komodo does give you one really neat feature, which is like if you hold down Control and hover over a color, it shows you what it is.
Okay.
Pretty nifty.
For things like FFF and 000, it would be kind of counterproductive to create something named black or white, because you can just use the word black or white.
True enough, yeah, because there are CSS colors properties that actually exist. So yeah, unless if you're always going to use like full black or full white for those, yeah, I would just use like the CSS named colors. And there are a few, like there's quite a large number of named CSS colors that we don't often use, but they're nice. There's a nice sort of palette of colors that we can make use of. There's also some really awful looking CSS default colors. Oh well. Magenta is my favorite color. Or maybe it's cyan. I just like saying those.
Flashing back.
That's what it is. That's the perfect website ever. It's just magenta and cyan flashing in sort of epileptic bouts. Okay, so let's look at what I've got here. So I've got the display block going, so I should be able to reload this page now, and when I get an error, it shouldn't break my button and have it appear down below. Good. Now I'd like maybe my success message to be styled in the same way as my error message, but with a green background. And so what I'll do here is this is where the error message is being defined. This is the colors for the error message, and this is sort of the shape of the error message. I'll keep the colors of the error message segmented just to p.error, but for the shape of it, I'll set that to p.error and p.success. So now a success message will have a border, it'll have some padding, it'll have a radius, and it'll have a margin, just like an error. So it'll look the same as the error message, and then I can apply separate coloring rules for success compared to error. And again, I'm sort of trying to remove repetition in my code. So I go back over here, add a tweet. My success message now looks just like the error message, except it's missing the coloring. And so I can apply some coloring rules to my p.success. And so for these, I'll give it a color of, for example, want it to be green, so like 00, A0, 0C, and a background color of BA, FF, BA. I'm being a little inconsistent here in that sometimes I'm lowercasing and sometimes I'm uppercasing. What do you guys think? Should I always do my hex codes in uppercase or lowercase? What do you guys do?
Lower.
Lower?
I don't bother hitting this shift key.
Okay, because it's an extra thing to hit, right?
Exactly.
I used to always do uppercase because that was just what I saw. When I would look at other people's code, I would always see uppercase, but
I guess it's about preference. Really.
I guess so. And it's just, I think with anything in programming, consistency is important. So
as a lazy programmer, I don't hit shift.
there you go. And BA, FF, BA. And so I should be able to, with Komodo, look at what these colors look like. So that's what the text will be. Probably want it to be a little bit darker than that. And that's what the background will be. That should be fine. That's an okay green. Maybe want this to be a little bit darker so I could take it down to maybe like 0.8. What? Oh, yeah, 8.0. Yeah, that's a bit better. 7.0. Yeah, okay. And let's try a success message. This should work, and we should see a green success message. There we go. So now I've got a pretty success message and a pretty error message. If I go back over here, there's not much I need to do to further clean up my SASS. I've got an example of some of the kind of nesting you can do. So all of these rules are nested inside of a wrapper. This LI is further nested inside of this UL. We could quickly hop over to the SASS page, and I could remember how to do SASS variables. Where do we learn SASS, please? Variables. Oh, they're pretty straightforward. So you just name a variable with a $ preceding it, and then a colon to define it, and then you just use it as that $ variable later on in your code. So for example, for this color here, I might up at the top here define that to be error background, and maybe I'll say error foreground. And my error foreground was what? Here it is. And now I should be able to use those variables in my code. So this would be $, error foreground, and this would be $, error background.
I think you put an underscore.
Oh, thanks. This is another thing that I've been struggling with. When should I be using dashes and when should I be using underscores? I don't know.
I use underscores.
For everything?
Yeah.
It seems like in the world of CSS, dashes seem to be preferred, like things like this. And so I always feel like in the CSS world, I should be using dashes, but because I use snake case for all of my programming, it's like the muscle memory always tries to do underscores for me. Again, I don't think it really matters as long as I'm inconsistent, or as long as I'm consistent. But yeah, I've just noticed that in the, again, even for things like this, border radius, it's border dashed radius. So it seems like CSS is sort of, you know, it encourages you to do dashes, but then you've got things like this coming from Rails, which is using underscores. So
the way I see it is the underscore can represent a space in the dash. If in real English you were to read that, it looked really weird.
yes, because you usually use a dash in English to sort of tie two related words together, not spacing. Yeah, I agree with you. So maybe I'll be fine with continuing to use underscores. Okay.
Stay consistent with the language.
Yeah, that's true too. Like again here, but then it's like I'm almost forced to be inconsistent because Ruby is being inconsistent with the language itself.
Right.
So this should still work. I've got my error message, but now it's a variable. So I should still, when I get an error, see the same text. CSS also has all these really neat operators that we can use. I think it's the operators that we can use. Where's my darken and lighten? Interesting things. Let's see. Darken. No. Where do you come into play? Oh, maybe I'm thinking of something else. Because you can do interesting like operator mathematics with SASS now, so you don't have to be tied to, you know, just setting something in EMs. You can actually do sort of math-based calculations to calculate things like widths and margins and whatnot, and those can also rely on variables that you find up at the top. So that can be an interesting way of applying things to a well, that's interesting too. Variables, oh, weird. A part of me thought that there was some capability in SASS to be able to do like color math. So to take one color and then make it darker or lighter. Let me see if that's actually something we can do. Darken color. Controlling color. Oh, so you can do that. Neat. So it's almost like I only need really one color of red. I could probably stick to just one color of red and then darken and lighten it for use with my foreground and my background. Let's see what happens when I darken the background. Darken background color by 50%. Let's see if this actually works or not. Yeah, so it looks awful, But it's interesting that SASS gives you those capabilities to be able to manipulate colors in different ways. So you can have a bunch of different colors set up top, and you could be using them throughout your document in different shades. So you could have certain darkened versions of set colors, certain lightened versions of set colors.
Basically like a scheme.
Yeah, you could sort of build a whole scheme up around a set of base colors. If we look at the page I was just looking at here. So here's like they have this one base color, this is the original, that's the lightened, that's the darkened. It makes for a fairly nice way of making a color scheme. And then if you went and changed that one base color, well then, you know, the darker, lighter versions would also work nicely. You can have saturated or desaturated versions of a color, or even you can adjust the hue of a color to bring it into a different spectrum of coloring. So oh, and even I think change the alpha transparency. So you can do lots of really interesting things. The color difference here? Yeah, it's hard to see up on the screen. On my screen here, it's quite obvious that it's gone, it's much oranger over here.
Okay.
It's lost sort of a bit of fidelity by going onto the overhead there. So anyways, yeah, you can do all sorts of neat color-based calculations with SASS as well. Let's see, back to my CSS. I think that's all I want to sort of show off as far as using SASS. I've only used one CSS file, just the one that was in the assets folder to begin with. As I said, we can add as many as we want in here to separate out our CSS rules if we wish to. We could have one where we just set up all of our variables, for example, just for our own sense of clarity. Yeah, we're now left with a pretty functional application that looks fairly nice, or at least nicer than it did before. And yeah, that's what I wanted to show off as far as last time we built up the functionality. This time we went to the look and feel. And let's just make sure my markup is valid. It is. All right, so I'm going to stop the screencast at this point in time.